Good evening, everyone. I'm Troy McKenzie, Dean of NYU School of Law, and it is my delight to welcome you to the 28th Annual Attorney General Robert Abrams Public Service Lecture. Thank you for being here to join us for this wonderful annual event, which really has become a signature event at our law school. For nearly 3 decades now, this lecture series has brought together some of the most distinguished voices in public service. It has served as a forum for discussions on pressing legal and policy issues of our time. But more than that, we are here together to celebrate the spirit of public service, which is a core value here at NYU. We are proud to honor those who have dedicated their careers and taken their talents to advance the public good through the law. And we are especially honored this evening to have with us Connecticut Attorney General William Tong. I know we are eager to hear his insights in just a few minutes, and Bob will formally introduce him shortly. But before that, I want to say a word of thanks to Attorney General Tong for being with us tonight, and to thank Bob and to introduce him. It is my privilege to introduce someone who has been a guiding light in public service for decades. Bob is a graduate of this law school, always a good sign. His career is really an extraordinary career. This is not a career that you just roll out of bed and inherit. It took a lot of talent and a lot of work, and anyone who has met Bob and seen the energy and the sparkle in his eyes knows exactly how he built this extraordinary career. A member of the New York State Assembly, Bronx Borough President, New York State Attorney General. And as Attorney General, he was transformative. He turned the office into a powerful advocate for justice, and over 4 terms in office, he built a model that frankly became the model for how the Attorney General of a state can be an advocate for environmental justice, civil rights, the ethical practice of finance, fairness in real estate. I could go on and on. His tenure was marked by groundbreaking legal reforms, and in the legislature and beyond, more than 250 of his legislative proposals eventually became law. So we are so happy to have him with us here this evening, and happy to have his vision in helping to create and steward this lecture series. Bob's career is an example for all of us: integrity, passion, and the unwavering belief in the power of law to effect positive change. These are the values that all of us should embrace. So thank you, Bob, and please come forward.
Thanks so much, Dean McKenzie. That was exceedingly generous and gracious of you, and deeply appreciated. And of course, we are all thankful for your exuberant leadership here at the law school. I also want to thank Lisa Hoyes and Gail Zweig and Maddie Montesteoca for all of their help to help get the word out and bring us all together. They've been doing a wonderful job for the last number of years. My wife is here. My wife, Diane. It's a few days before our 50th anniversary. And lately, she's been zeroing in on a theme. There's too much negativity. Bob, there's just too much negativity around, whether it's in the public discourse or whether it's in politics. And I think she's right, and I began to think about that, and I began to wonder whether and how it potentially impacted other things of importance and value to us. For example, how is this negativity affecting our impression of our country? I don't know about you, but I think this is the greatest country in the world. It might be even the greatest country in the history of the world. Does it mean it's perfect? Of course not. I mean, it's got loads of imperfections. No person, no institution is 100% perfect. And certainly that's true of America. And I began to wonder, though, do people share my values? Do they share my view that it's a great country? Do they understand all of the wonderful things freedoms that this country provides? And among those things that it provides is that it's a place of opportunity, a place of opportunity. Whoever you are in this audience, in this law school, hopefully you've got ambition and dreams and thoughts and aspirations. And so my word to you is go for it. Get out there and go for it. Because this country allows you to do that. It's a meritocracy. It allows you to go and aspire and win and cling to the better instincts of you and those around you. And one of the other things that it enables you to do is to dream and to work at it. Now, this theme of opportunity is the very essence of our guest speaker tonight, William Tong. His parents, Chinese immigrants, came to live in Hartford, Connecticut. They opened up a Chinese restaurant. They worked 7 days a week. There were 5 children in the family. Each worked in the restaurant. They worked hard. William Tong, he had ability, had motivation, and he had aspirations. As a result of all that, graduated from Phillips Academy, Andover, Brown University, Chicago University Law School. He got a job at one of the great law firms in this country, Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett. He had a vision. I should aspire to be in public office. He ran for the State House, the House of Representatives in the state of Connecticut. He won 6 times. He was there for 12 years. He ascended to the highest level of responsibility in terms of importance of committees, the chair of the Banking Committee, the chair of the Judiciary Committee. He ran for Attorney General, and he won, becoming the first Asian American to win statewide in the state of Connecticut, becoming the first Chinese American to be elected Attorney General in this country's history. He's only been in that office 6 years, but his leadership, his talent, and you'll see that in a few moments, is easily recognized. And so even though he's been there a short time, his colleagues have already gravitated to him and given him the honor of being the chair of the Eastern Conference of Attorneys General and to become the vice president of the National Association of Attorneys General. And in a couple of years, because of the succession in that organization, he's going to become the president of the National Association of Attorneys General. As Attorney General, he's been courageous, he's been independent, he's been out there fighting violence, gun violence, domestic violence, fighting for a women's right to choose, trying to make sure that that opioid epidemic doesn't continue and go forward, and those who were responsible for it paid a price, and those resources going for some public interest, some public interest work, fighting for the public against price fixing with generic drugs, fighting on a whole number of levels and fronts. And so we're all privileged tonight to be in the presence of and inspired by a voice of independence, a voice of integrity, the great Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, William Tong.
Thank you, General Abrams, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. I guess I better not suck then. It's a real thrill for me to be with a living legend and the gold standard. Don't let Dick Blumenthal hear me say that, but the gold standard for state attorneys general is Bob Abrams. He's a legend. We model ourselves after him, this huge multi-state world that we now are a part of, in which we do so many things together, Democrats and Republicans. Bob Abrams and his generation of AGs built that ship. So please, thanks so much to General Abrams. And Diane, congratulations, 50 years, or my condolences, I'm not sure which one it is. Thank you, Dean McKenzie, for inviting me here to this beautiful room, this beautiful law school. Dean McKenzie and I had a chance to talk about Purdue Pharma on the way in, and he told me I was wrong. I'm not. Supreme Court said I was right. But Dean McKenzie, I told you upstairs that I'd never been in this building. It has special meaning because I'm an almost alum. So I spent my freshman year of college at NYU. And I lived at 10th and Waverly and then in Brittany Hall. So I almost made it here, but I ended up in Providence, unfortunately, and then to Chicago for law school. Thank you to the Public Interest Law Center and Dean Hoyes, where's she? She's up there. Thank you very much, and your team, and to the students, and my good friend, Senator Will Haskell. I asked if you guys call him Senator. Please don't, he's just Will. But it's great to be with Will and with all of you, and to get a few minutes to share some thoughts with all of you. There's so much we could talk about. But I thought, since I was invited here as a guest of not just the law school, but the Public Interest Law Center, that I would talk about the public interest, and I would talk about public service. And one of the questions, and I wonder, Will, if you feel this way, one of the questions that I find hardest to answer, that I get asked a lot, is why? Why did you run for office? Why public service? Because it's a complicated and very personal question. And they often ask me, well, why do you do it, and why do you pursue the cases that you pursue and you prioritize? And I really struggle with this question of motivation because, sometimes when people ask you this question, it feels sort of like an indictment, right? For those of us who run for office, it feels a little bit like somebody's questioning your motives. Is this really about your personal ambition? What is your ulterior motive? Why would you willfully, for most of your career, make so much less money than you could, for example, at Simpson Thacher or in private practice? And there must be something up. And so I feel that heat when people ask that question. Also, I find it hard because I said before, it's complicated. And so for most of us, unless you're somebody who was influenced or motivated by a single seminal event or trauma, and that's true for some of us, for most of us, there's a lot of stuff that pushes us to this place. Experiences, good and bad. Some trauma, our identity, right? And we wrestle with that for our whole lives. And yes, some inspiration and not a small amount of ambition. But for me, it starts with a window. So General Abrams talked about my parents' Chinese restaurant, the Sampan restaurant in Wethersfield, Connecticut. And in the restaurant, the kitchen had a door that swung in and out between the kitchen and the dining room. And the door had a diamond-shaped, I think it was a plexiglass window. And starting in 6th grade, 7th grade, I worked side by side with my parents in that Chinese restaurant on nights and weekends. My parents worked 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. But I, nights and weekends, particularly Friday, Saturday night, I was called off the bench to help them, particularly when business wasn't so hot anymore. And I remember walking by that door hundreds of times a night. And I would look through that window, and I would see people in the dining room enjoying Friday night dinner with their families. And I was keenly aware that those people in the dining room didn't look like me. And it was my job to work with my parents to serve them. And I'm grateful for those people. They paid for my education. They gave me every opportunity in this country. But I was always aware that there was this figurative and literal separation, right? A door between me and them in this dining room. And my job was to serve them. And I felt like we were invisible to the people in the dining room. And so I can still remember the smell, the heat, how hot and chaotic it was in that kitchen, and feeling like I just wanted to get out of that kitchen into the dining room to literally be a part of that community and get a seat at the table. When you grow up like I did in a hot Chinese restaurant kitchen, you see how your parents suffer every single day. 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's rough. And you also see how the people the dishwashers and the sous chefs and the other cooks and the waiters and waitresses, how they struggle because they live their lives there too. And you hear about all that they're going through in their families and in their lives, and you just want to help them, right? It shouldn't be this hard. And so every morning I get up and I think that kitchen, that door, that window is why I'm here. So much of what I do, so much of who I am goes back to that Chinese restaurant. And I often say that, yes, I get to be here for an hour as the Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, but I woke up this morning that heavy-set Chinese kid in a Chinese restaurant, and when I go home to Stanford tonight, I'm gonna go to bed that same kid. And when you grow up the way that I did, and so many of us did, so many of us have some piece of this story. It may not be exactly like mine, but something about what I've said and the way I've lived and have grown up resonates with you. And when you grow up the way that we did, it leaves a mark on you. I also know I'm here because I'm very fortunate. I'm very fortunate that in one generation that I was able to travel the very long distance from my parents' Chinese restaurant kitchen to be Attorney General of the state of Connecticut. That one generation transition happens only one place in this world. I believe that, in this country. And it still happens. It's hard, and maybe it's a lot harder, but I am living proof that it does happen. It happens to regular people. But I also know that it could have gone the other way. Every time I walk into a Chinese takeout place, and Will and I are gonna have dinner, and we'll see people running, either a Chinese takeout place or a Mexican place or a pizza place. We'll see people with, food trucks. Every time I see them, every time I walk into a restaurant, I know that it could have gone a very different way for us. And no matter how hard my parents worked and no matter how much they struggled, that life can be pretty arbitrary, and you have to get lucky. And if life was 5 degrees this way or 5 degrees that way, I wouldn't be standing here right now. What do I mean by that? Well, my dad is an immigrant. That's the nice polish I put on it. My parents and grandparents are really refugees. My grandparents ran from the War of Japanese Aggression and the Communist Revolution. My dad also from violence and homelessness and hunger, and somehow from Greater China, they end up in Hartford, Connecticut. And he immigrates to this country with a tourist visa, okay? And so he meets my mom in a Chinese restaurant in Bloomfield, Connecticut. They open a Chinese restaurant in Hartford, and one day, an agent from the Immigration and Naturalization Service. They called it INS back then, not ICE. INS shows up, this is before I was born, and says, Mr. Tong, we love your restaurant, we eat here, but you're on an expired tourist visa. You gotta go. And so my parents, they weren't gonna run, they weren't gonna go underground. My dad had an opportunity to go to school in Canada, so they prepared to pack up and go back to Canada, and just basically end what they had started, had just gotten started here in this country. So my dad's driving home one night on what we call the Berlin Turnpike in the Hartford area. And he just thinks to himself, I've come all this way and overcome so much. Like, am I just gonna give up and just leave? So he goes home to their apartment, gets out a pen, piece of paper. He writes a 6-page handwritten letter to the President of the United States. And he says, I'm not a criminal, I'm just a business person, I just want a chance in this country. And he begged for the opportunity to stay in this country. Put a stamp on it, put an envelope, mailed it off to the White House, and he thought what everybody else would think. That's it, I'm done. No one's gonna read my letter. That's it, it's over. We'll pack up, we'll leave. Shortly before they were going to voluntarily self-deport, the same INS agent comes back into my parents' restaurant. My parents believe he had a letter. We don't have the letter, but they think it came from the Attorney General of the United States. And the letter says, the president has received your letter. We welcome you to stay in this country. You have to go to the back of the line and wait your turn. But please stay and become Americans. And my parents did not become citizens until several years after I was born. But it was because of Richard Nixon's extraordinary act of grace and compassion that I was born the first American in my family. Now, if this were to happen, thank you. If this were to happen today, right? If this were to happen today, you know that people would call my dad illegal, right? At best, undocumented. And I would be called probably an anchor baby, and I am. But I'm very proud and very lucky that I was born and grew up in a country that valued immigrants, that honored our contributions, and that gave my family every chance. Now, I've told this story, Will's heard this story. I've told this story 7,000 times on the campaign trail, okay? And for a number of years at like Thanksgiving or Chinese New Year, I would say to my mom, Mom, I just want to make sure this story is true. Okay? She says, yeah, it's totally true. I'm like, no, it can't be bull, right? It's got to be real. I've now told it like, during a debate for Attorney General, I've told it like 7,000 times. It's got to be true. It's totally true. Fine. 2019, my parents get invited to a funeral. They have to go to a funeral in California. And they decide to go to the Nixon Presidential Library. And they walk up to the front desk, and my dad says, I wrote a letter to President Nixon, like 1970, whatever it was. Do you have it? And the attendant says, I don't know, but give us your name, number, cell number, email, date of birth, all that sort of stuff, and we'll get back to you. So this is right before Christmas. They give all the information, they go home, they think nothing of it. 2 weeks later, they get an email from presidential records, and attached to the email is a PDF. And they receive what is nothing short of a Christmas miracle. There's a PDF copy of my dad's letter to President Nixon. I should have thought to bring it here today, but in many ways, this is an incredible story. in many ways, it's an unremarkable story, because guess what? There are so many people who have lived this experience. People right now in New York City, right, who are going through this, who have gone through it. Maybe not Richard Nixon, maybe not the Berlin Turnpike, certainly not Hartford, Connecticut, but so many people caught a break. They did everything they could. They fought hard, they worked hard, they made every sacrifice, and then they caught a break. And I would argue a break that really only happens here. And it's because of that break and that incredible good fortune that I am so grateful. And also it's why I picked the work that I do and the cases that I prosecute. So immigration is not something that normally is the province of the states. It's mostly a federal matter. But when the former president was president, and frankly under President Obama as well, ICE was very active in rounding up immigrants and in deporting them. And this happened when I was in the state legislature. But a family of Chinese Americans, they are not yet citizens, in Farmington, Connecticut, were arrested. And they're actually Chinese of North Korean descent. And so they run a nail salon, and neighbors, customers found out they'd been arrested, and they rose up. And as happened under the previous president, there were demonstrations and people rallied around their neighbors, and this happened many times in Connecticut and probably all over the country and in your communities too. Because they were treasured members of the community, people loved them, and they were on the verge of being deported. They had two American-born sons, teenagers, and if they were to be deported, they would be sent back to China and likely back to North Korea. So their story makes the wire, makes the AP. And one night, the AP writes a story, and my sister, who's a deputy editor at the New York Times, at the time she was working at the Times, and she saw this story come over the wire about this Chinese family in Farmington, Connecticut, who's on the verge of being deported. And she forwards me the story, and she sends a simple text. She said, "That could easily be us." And as if I needed any more motivation, but it really hit me that is absolutely true. If that INS agent had treated my dad a little differently, if Richard Nixon had responded to the letter, if we lived in a different place and a different time, that could easily be us. And so to make a long story short, I weighed in. I asked the then governor, Governor Dan Malloy, to weigh in. We didn't have any obvious authority. This is a lesson in the hard powers and the soft powers of being an elected official. We had no hard powers, okay? ICE is in control. I had no obvious standing. I had no obvious role to play. But I got the governor to meet with the Huangs and to call people at ICE. And he called 3 different people right before they were going to get deported. Again, he had no obvious authority. And after he meets them, after several hours of making phone calls, he calls me and he says, "William, we've done it. I got it. They're staying." And I said, "Governor, what did you do?" He said, "I just called 3 different relatively senior people at ICE." And I said, "Governor, you must have been very persuasive." He said, "No, I was very pissed off." And sometimes it just takes one very pissed off governor. Let me close by telling you that this carried me into my tenure as Attorney General. And when I became Attorney General, I heard about 2 immigrants, Richard Thompson and Wazara Walton, 2 people who came here as children and who had been picked up for for committing felonies. They'd been prosecuted and convicted. Non-violent felonies, I should add. Mr. Thompson got into a bar fight. Miss Walton stole things from Babies R Us for her infant child. But they were felonies. They got arrested. ICE picks them up. They're going to get deported. Trouble is, under the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, there's something called the Pardon Waiver Clause. And the Pardon Waiver Clause says if you've been pardoned for your crimes, you can't get deported under the INA. You could get deported for some other reason, but you can't get deported because you committed a felony if you've been pardoned for the felony. And Connecticut had pardoned both of these people. ICE's argument under the previous president was that Connecticut's pardons didn't count. And they didn't count because they weren't strictly gubernatorial pardons. They were pardons by a commission, a board of pardons and paroles, that actually pardoned these two individuals. And they proceeded to deport them. And we interceded and intervened. And I argued in front of the First Circuit and the Second Circuit. In the First Circuit for Mr. Thompson, and in the Second Circuit for Wazara Walton. And I showed them that they do count for a variety of reasons. In particular, because 6 states do it the way that we do, okay? 5 states are run by the other party. Connecticut stood alone as the sole Democratic state. And it seemed awfully like they were picking on us. And so I made this argument to the First Circuit, the Second Circuit, and because of our efforts, both Richard Thompson and Wazara Walton were released from custody in the United States today and living their best lives. So when I get up tomorrow, I get to be the chief legal officer of the state of Connecticut. And I have the best job in state government. When people ask me about my job, I tell them I can't think of 5 lawyer jobs in the world that I would rather have. But there are a lot of hard days and a lot of tough issues. You know, in the Department of Children and Families, in corrections, it's not always a barrel of monkeys in the Office of the Attorney General. But there are also days when you really get to help somebody, where you really get to lean in and help the Huangs, help Richard Thompson, help Wazara Walton, help her daughter. And if you're really lucky, you get to help somebody just like you. Thank you very much.
So look, you've got this rare opportunity. You've got an important public official in front of you. Ask him a question. Who's gonna get up and ask the first question? I know it's always difficult to break the ice, but there must be someone here.
They can smell the food. I was a student once.
I'll ask the first
Sure.
one, because maybe, you know, people need to warm up a little bit. So I was very lucky. I wrote a book, The Luckiest Guy in the World, a lot of reasons for that. I was lucky because when I was AG, I call it the halcyon days. We were working together. It didn't matter. When I was the president of NAG, the National Association of Attorneys General, some say it's the National Association of Aspiring Governors, NAAG.
No comment.
I reached out to Republicans and Democrats. It didn't matter whether you were a big state or small state, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, East, West. Today, the atmosphere in politics is toxic. And I sense, and you know, the AGs were different. There was a National Governors Association and a Democratic Governors Association, a Republican Governors Association. We only had the National Association of Attorneys General, but unfortunately, since then, there's now a Democratic Attorneys General Association, Republican Attorneys General. So the question is there still some opportunity for AGs to work together and do some important things?
Thank you for that question. Of course, the answer is yes. Otherwise, frankly, what's the point, right? Unless there's hope and optimism and effort, we don't just hope, we do something about it. A little perspective. Look, we are either in or staring into the darkness right now. There's no doubt about that. this is a really ugly, difficult time. There are existential questions and risks that threaten the greatest nation and the greatest community ever assembled on Earth, and I believe in recorded human history. All of that is true. And I don't want to minimize how bad it is. It's really bad. I mean, really bad. And I will tell you, there was no worse day than when I got a call from my Deputy Attorney General, and she said, time to get back to work. Your Republican colleagues have gone to the Supreme Court seeking to overturn the results of the presidential election. We've got to fight for our country right now. I mean, that was ugly, and it will be ugly again. And no matter who wins, it's going to be ugly. So all that being said, a little perspective. This is not the end of history, right? Generations before have always thought that their existential crisis was the end of history. It's not the end of history. Far from it. Yes, technology disruption, it's crazy, right? The world changes every 7 seconds. We get whiplash from how much is going on, and we're buffeted by the tumult that we experience. But just everybody settle down. It's not 1968, right? It's not 1860, okay? It's not 1939 through 45 in Germany, right? And in Poland. We don't have slavery anymore. So we've been in very dark places as a people in human history, and we've come out of it, and we're resilient. But people had to do extraordinary things to pull us out of it. I just went to Normandy to celebrate and commemorate the 80th anniversary of the landing there. And, you're just struck by the fact that 18-year-old boys jumped out of planes to get slaughtered to save us from a war that cost more than 80 million people on Earth. 80 million people. There are people alive now who fought in that conflict, remember that conflict? 80 million people. And the number's probably much higher, right? When they talk about how many people died in the Pacific, Chinese, Koreans, and others, sometimes they'll say, well, the number's between 12 and 16 million or 50. And so just a little perspective. Human beings have always been awful to each other and have committed unspeakable atrocities, but it takes people to pull us out of it. And we have to get to that hard work of doing that. Before these remarks, I talked about my first meeting as AG, where Democrats and Republicans came together. Most of us showed up. Nowadays, at a National Association of Attorneys General meeting, we have trouble getting my Republican colleagues to show up, and that's hard. But and some of us are like, forget them. We're just going to go our own way. We're going to do our own thing. And I will tell you, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this. He might, but in Normandy, I walked downstairs for breakfast, and Ken Paxton was standing there at the buffet line by himself, the Texas Attorney General. Everybody in this room knows who Ken Paxton is. Everybody knows what that means. I went up to Ken Paxton and I said, Ken, you want to have breakfast? And this was like a month ago. And we filled up our plates and we sat down, just the two of us, and we sat over in a corner at some hotel in Normandy, and we just broke bread together and spent time together. And I could feel like Tish James's eyes in the back of my head, like, what are you doing over there? I was doing my job, right? And so I encourage all of you in whatever you do, like, it's your job too. You're not allowed to say, forget it. You're not allowed to say, forget them, it's over, we're just doing our own thing. Because that leads nowhere good.
Okay, did we inspire somebody to?
Back there.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's an honor to meet both of you. First of all, I would like to say thank you, and it is an honor to meet both of you. I made a mistake. I'm here the wrong day, but God makes no mistakes.
Yes.
So I just wanted to say, I commend you because so many immigrants, once they get past, they forget their fellow men. My mother's African American. We didn't come through Ellis Island. My father is Panamanian, well, born here, but my grandparents came here for a better life. I grew up over there. My mother had a business in Greenwich Village, and I know exactly what you mean by that. When you see your family work together and pull, and it keeps you up. And I've had different career changes, and I just say, I have to keep going and keep going because the people before me fought so hard. And yes, I've traveled the world. We do have our problems, but America is the greatest place, and we have to make sure it stays like that. And thank you both.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us. You've spoken very powerfully, I think, about the ability to use your office to impact people's lives positively. But, you know, one of the things that's inevitable in public service is that you can't help everybody, and there will be cases that you lose and times that you can't make the difference that you want. And I'd love to hear how you rebound from that kind of failure or roadblock, or how you approach the job knowing that that is something that might be on the horizon.
When you serve as an attorney general, you know, apart from being chief legal officer of the state, which I know Bob as well, I take that part of my job very seriously. That's the defensive side and the counseling side of the work. But on the affirmative side, sometimes you're the only person that can help. The opioid and addiction crisis is the worst public health crisis in America. It's going nowhere. As long as I'm Attorney General, I'll be working on this crisis. As long as I'm alive, it will be the worst public health crisis in America. Why? Because there's no cure for it. Right? We have to get people into treatment, and we have to keep them in treatment and recovery and hope that it takes. And for so many people, all of us have been touched, okay? So many of us know somebody who was doing really bad, and then they were doing okay, and then they weren't, right? This is the horror of, you know, that and gun violence and other things, but this is the public health crisis of our time. And waiting for Congress to do something about it, good luck. You know, and that's why I'm here. Congress is broken. So many things, Section 230, you know, holding the social media companies accountable, generic drug prices, so much that you know, tobacco, so much Congress could have done and saved us all the trouble, but because Congress is unable to discharge its basic functions and responsibilities, and this is why Keith Ellison and Javier Becerra and others go home to become Attorney General, because they've had it in Congress. We are the first and last line of defense. And so we have no choice. And I don't have the luxury of saying we might lose. So when the Sacklers offered $3 billion, I led the dissenters in saying, that's not enough, no way. And that wasn't a hard sale. My fellow attorneys general were like, yeah, that's not enough. But when it got to $4.375 billion, you know, that was, you know, when everybody tightened up. And a bunch of my colleagues, including Tish and Maura Healy, Josh Shapiro, they're like, William, that's enough, okay? We've got $4.3 billion. You proved your point. We're gonna settle. And I said, it still doesn't do it. And they said, why? And they said, because there are victims, survivors, people that have lost sons and daughters who need us to fight for them. And in particular, Liz Fitzgerald, Christine Gagnon, who between the two of them lost 3 sons. Now, there are other victims, by the way, and parents who were like, take the money, stop messing around. But these 2 moms really made an impression on me. And so I said no, and led a group of total of 9 AGs, 8 states in the District of Columbia, in opposing the $4.37 billion plan. And they said, why? That money will go a long way to treatment, prevention, and addiction science. And my response was, it's not just about the money. It's about justice. It's about holding them accountable. And as far as I can tell, the Sacklers took at least $11 billion out of the company. They will be bazillionaires many times over after they pay this money, and no Sackler will have to sell a house or a car or a boat or a piece of jewelry or a piece of art. And so I hung in there, and when Judge Dean, as you know, tried to confirm a plan of reorganization for Purdue Pharma and to cram down a settlement at $4.375 billion, we opposed them and went to district court to try to overturn that plan, vacate that plan. So people say, William, how did you know you were going to win when you took that huge risk and went into district court in New York, Judge McMahon, to try to overturn this plan in this bankruptcy that everybody's watching, everybody cares about? I say 2 things. Number 1, I had a great group of colleagues, the 9 of us together, but I had one hidden or secret weapon, not so hidden. And that is, it matters which states are on your side, and I had California. Okay? But number 2, they say, well, how did you know you were gonna win on the merits and you were gonna win this lawsuit in front of Judge McMahon? And now, in hindsight, I say, I didn't know. I rolled the dice. And sometimes that's what it takes.
Any other questions?
In the back.
Yes.
I know that Attorney General Abrams said one of his great loves was the Antitrust Bureau founding work in that area. I wonder if, Attorney General, you could speak a little bit more to NAG and Connecticut, particularly in the tech space, which is so troublesome at the current day.
So I think we're beginning another golden age of antitrust enforcement. There's so much action because Joe Lieberman, Dick Blumenthal, George Jepson. I come from a particularly august line. I don't come from this line, which I did, but I come from a very significant line of AGs who are always active in that space. What I say to people about tech is, if we had not taken action against Microsoft 20 years ago, there would be no Google. There'd be no Facebook. There'd be no Instagram. And that's why I think knowing that and knowing that sometimes the markets don't work and they're not efficient and monopoly power is real and anti-competitive behavior is real, that we have had to weigh in. And with Jonathan Cantor as the Assistant Attorney General in charge of antitrust at the DOJ, we've been very aggressive. My personal piece of this is back in 2013, a couple of Assistant Attorneys General, if you wonder how this works, a couple of Assistant Attorneys General saw an article in the New York Times about a heart drug called digoxin. And the article, just an everyday article, the article was about how the price of digoxin for heart disease had gone up 500% for like no good reason, okay? And so these 2 guys, Mike Cole and Joel Nielsen, walked up to George Jepson's office and said, George, there's something up with this heart drug, digoxin. Can we take a look? And George said, yeah, sure. So they started investigating. They sent out civil investigative demands, and they started getting documents from generic drug manufacturers. Okay, why are prices the way they are? They started to get a sense from some email chatter that they were picking up that there was a conspiracy to fix prices. Okay, but they didn't have the smoking gun yet. So what they did have was cell phone records, and I think the defendants thought they were being very clever. They dumped tons of cell phone records on us, thinking they would drown us in paper. So we said, can we have that in electronic form? Sure. Okay. We bought software that the DEA uses to analyze phone calls by actual drug dealers, query if there's much difference between them. We pumped the cell phone records into this software and boom, we saw that competitors were talking to each other at a highly unusual and abnormal rate. And when prices went up, those conversations spiked. We didn't know what they were saying. We just know that competitors would call each other and talk for a minute, call back a half hour later, 5 minutes, call back tomorrow, 45 minutes. And it would all happen right before a price increase. And so we hit the mother lode. That's why I'm leading the National Generic Drug Price Fixing case, because the generic drug industry is rigged. Competitors are colluding to fix prices. And that's why the drug that I take, doxycycline, many of you have taken doxycycline. I take it for, it's a common thing you take for skin conditions, for rosacea. The doxycycline that I take has gone up in price by 8,000%. This is a drug that was developed 40 years ago. No one's working to pay back the cost of research and development by this point. And so that's why Connecticut is a leader in that space. We're also a part of Google. By the way, you want to know why I had breakfast with Ken Paxton? Because we do a lot of work together. Texas is a big state, and Texas does a lot of work in the Google antitrust space. And so we need Texas to hang in there. So Google, Facebook, Instagram, Amazon, Apple, Ticketmaster, Live Nation. There's so much action in this space. We could do a whole nother discussion about antitrust, but stay tuned. There's a lot of rich opportunity for people to get engaged and get involved.
Okay, one last question. Yes, sir.
I'm not techie. Any talent that I had when I was younger is gone. So someone
Me too.
told me that if you have any questions about your cell phone or computer, you could ask anybody as young as 7 years old to help you, and you'll get some help. I'm wondering if there's anything in the public school education system where there could be some knowledge given to young people, whether it's as young as 7 years or 10 years old or 12 years old, but some education given for the importance of democracy, importance to the life of our country and our people and our civilization, whether it's just comparing the United States to the governments of the world, or namely to teach people what democracy is, what the United States is that's different or unique or wonderful, for a semester or a series of classes for a couple of years, some beginning to educate people to feel that they are part of a country, they're part of a civilization, they're part of society, they are part of, having children or not having children.
Yes.
But some sense of responsibility or desire to participate in the life of a citizen of the United States of America.
Yes. That's why we're here. That's why this institution is so important. That's why the issues that you'll talk about, con law, even Civ Pro, bankruptcy, these are the bedrock foundations of not just of our country and our democracy, but of who we are. I think at some point along the way, my view is, in the mid-'80s, our country changed, and people decided that the purpose of every public and private institution in this country is to make us as rich as we can possibly be. And that's just not true. That's not the point. And I think that's why we have de-emphasized civic education, government, public discourse. We've stopped, we've forgotten how to talk to each other and how to engage with each other and how to have honest disagreements with each other. And we have to obviously get back to that. You know, there's so much emphasis on STEM. So I have an 18-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 13-year-old. You know, I'm in the lane, and there's so much talk about STEM and tech, and it's great, yeah, like amazing, love it. But there's humanity, right? And there's what binds us together, and it takes all of us being willing to do that work and to be a part of it. And it's incumbent upon all these law students to demand it when they go out in the world, not just as lawyers, but as parents and as people on PTAs and as members of the community, right? To demand that your children get that education and that they find their way not just as engineers, but as Americans, and not to forget that and not to give that up.
Let's give a final round of applause to a great public service. That was fantastic. Very important.